kind of project would be best to get the story of the quilt out, to share the story of the quilt. So it's a quilt maker sitting down with a volunteer and being interviewed for 30 to 45 minutes, talking about a touchstone quilt. So they would hang a quilt behind them and sort of focus their conversation at the beginning on that quilt. Yeah. And so sort of tell me about the quilt that you brought today is the first question. And so Pat and Bernie and several other board members developed this sort of standard list of questions. And they started it at the International Quilt Festival, provided the space and the volunteers, and the Alliance had an incredible group of volunteers headed by Karen Musgrave. And they collected, that started in 1999. So that was the start, and now there are over 1,000 interviews archived in the Library of Congress. So it started out at the University of Delaware, but eventually the collection made its way to the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and now we're in the midst of what every oral history archive keeper deals with, which is getting it to the right level of technology, bringing it up to date. So these were cassette recordings and printed out Word documents, right? So
transcripts. I was one of the people transcribing. That was my job.
Exactly. So, some of them are digital recordings. In fact, all of those we have now sort of got a finding aid of, and we know what we have. And we are in the midst of transitioning our database to another one so that you can not only have a transcript and the audio, which we've never been able to release or share the audio of those interviews. Now we're going to also index these interviews.
Wow. That's huge. Especially for scholars working on working with them. That was always this frustration is, well, how do you know what's in there?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And we've looked at projects like oye.org, which is the Supreme Court archives, where Jerry Goldman, who heads that project, was on our board for a while. And that really opened my eyes to, I'm sure the technology is even better now, but how you could do a keyword search of a transcript, and then it would queue it up to the audio at the same point.
That's amazing, right?
Yeah. So, but I think for us, the main thing right now is the vision that keeps us going is having quilters and quilt enthusiasts everywhere be able to bring these interviews up and, like a podcast, turn it on and listen to it while you're working.
I think that would be awesome.
Because it would. I would listen to that whole collection and go through it. And
so, what's the time period that you did the interviews? Are they still going, or what period did you do those interviews?
They are. There's only a trickle of them coming in now because we're not encouraging and actively publicizing the project because we have so much transition work to do that we don't want to make it so that there's a lag time between when someone does the interview and when it's published, because that's discouraging because it's a lot of work, as you know, to do that transcription and make the arrangements with the person. And it's so golden. Once you've done the interview, you feel really protective of that recording and of that person. And you want to make sure that their story comes to the public as soon as possible with as little errors as possible. So until we feel like that process is streamlined, we don't want to risk collecting more further.
Really interesting. Super interesting. Love it. All right, you've got 1,000 different projects, so I want to talk to you a little bit more about these. So first of all, what is it like to be the executive director of Quilt Alliance? What's your life like, and what has your experience been being kind of the preserver and sharer of a quilting culture?
It's great. I have really enjoyed, as I said, sort of getting to know different perspectives on quilts. I've always been a textile person, as I said, but I have not been a quilt maker. And I have, since I started working with the Quilt Alliance, actually constructed teeny tiny quilts up to a medium-sized lap quilt. But that's really the fascination for me, is the permutations involved in quilts. Like, there's just you could never make you could never finish making quilts in a sense because you're like snowflakes, you could just
Yeah.
make a different one every time you make it because it's made by hand for one thing, and because they're just umpteen, endless, infinite patterns. So that keeps me interested in what I'm doing. I'm also very interested in people. I'm a very high empathy person. So I find myself, so it allows me the flexibility to also have a sort of unconventional life, which I do. Having working from home, I have been working from home for probably, this is my 11th year, I think, with the Alliance, and I've worked from home for about three or four of those. Our office in Asheville moved a couple of times just because we have always been housed by other nonprofits and they tend to fluctuate. So right now we're all working from home. And honestly, I kind of prefer that because I have the flexibility to work whenever is the best time for me to work. So there's that part about working for a nonprofit and working with a small group. But I think that whole thing of being constantly fascinated by quilts is something that just keeps me riveted to the art itself. The people are fascinating. Oh, I was going to say that I joke because every time I lecture now, for some reason, I get this one part of the PowerPoint just makes me like choke up a little bit.
Yeah.
It's really funny. It's probably also just being, the age I am, but you get more sentimental as you age. But there's so many reasons people make quilts. And when you hear the story, and you can never really fully appreciate the story, the experience of that person making that object. Now, I know that we could probably say this about making furniture or making clocks or making brooms, whatever. But because I'm a textile person, it hits me in a different way.
And there's something is different about a chair versus a quilt. There is something special about quilts that I can't quite, it's like, there's like I feel like it's infused like with physical love or something like that. There is something about the process that is more than just, it's just, and when people talk about it and why they quilt and the level of creativity and community and meaning. One of the people we interviewed said that why she quilts changes throughout her life, but it's always a constant, which I thought was really interesting. That like they contemplate why they're doing it, which is really interesting. I don't know. I find it's different. At least from my perspective, there is something different in who is quilting. Seems like a very thoughtful group. It isn't just like, now I'm sure painters are thoughtful too and other people, but it is kind of remarkable to me that there's something really, I can't quite figure it out yet, but there's something really special about the quilters.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I did ask my daughter once, my kids were big blankie people.
Mm-hmm.
They both had their own blankies, and still have them. And I said, well, Lily, why is Favra like more the special, is the best thing to have when you're feeling sad? Or she said, and I said, but you also love this, whatever, it was some object that wasn't textile. And she goes, you can't put that up to your face. You can't put that up to your face, so it's like that really personal body thing, but also that it's oftentimes quilts are made from fabric that came from clothing or something else special. I made a quilt for my mom from the first curtains she ever bought for the first house she ever had.
Oh, that's so cool.
That she bought. So it's like those kinds of things that have they reach back into, and I know people feel that way about, woodworkers feel that way about wood that came from a tree that they cared about or something like that. But I do try to keep those in mind because I think that the overarching connections with material culture are important. And I think that for us, we're a nonprofit that's really trying to connect to all people who own or care about quilts, not just the people that make them, the people that sell them, the people that study them. And I think that is the trajectory that we're on right now. We spent the first 25 years producing projects that are just incredible. And many of them, it is unbelievable what this small group of people
Incredible.
did. And I say that mostly of the people that were before my time here created with these projects. It's substantial. And so now this phase of our life, I think, is really about the education and outreach piece, that we want to take all this content that we've collected with the help of all these tellers and knowers and connect it to people that don't know anything about this.
I think it's so cool.
World.
So do you think you'll take all of the material and like do a podcast or something like that with the material?
Yeah, we are just launching on not really a podcast, but a web show that we're calling Story Bee. We're actually recording our first test tomorrow with
fabulous.
Victoria Finley Wolf, but it's the idea is just to sort of do glimpses into what we're doing, the other work that we're doing, but just for our members. Also, it's a promotional thing to encourage people to be members. But we are doing a traveling education program called Quilt Story Roadshow.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. What is that?
So guilds and groups can hire us to come and do a lecture or a half day or a full day workshop where we actually do recordings with members of their groups.
Oh, how fabulous. That's really great. I love it.
Yeah, it's really fun. We've done one official, but many more that were before we were calling that. But it's a way to also spread the word about labeling, why it's important to label.
Right. I like the label pledge, right? What do you call it? Like
the labeling pledge.
The labeling pledge. It's awesome. I have not been labeling, so I'm going to label now. So
yeah, I mean,
there's a bit of shyness though. I'm like, I don't think I should label stuff, but that's not true, right? That's not true.
That's a huge part of it. I mean, I actually did part of my master's thesis in fine art about signing work, and not just the act of signing it, but calling yourself an artist. Like,
yeah, that's really interesting.
That in our culture, there's a little bit of wariness about artists, right? We don't understand artists. They're making stuff through their magic or something, their talent. You're either talented or you're not talented. That all goes down to even a child's level of children being able to draw until someone tells them they can't draw or they've done it wrong.
Right.
So there's just
this divide that, because one of the first interviews, she's like, oh yeah, I'm not an artist. I'm like, then you look at her quilt and you're like, yeah, you are. Like, what do you think an artist is, right? Like, but there's this sort of sense of like, oh no, that's not me. I just dabble a bit,
Yeah.
And then she's got like 500 colors in this weird, crazy quilt. You know what I mean? It's just like, okay, well, when do you think you become an artist? So I think that's interesting with quilters because there is this interesting divide. And so you think that's the reason that people like me and others don't put labels on our quilts, because we feel like that's...
I think it's one of the reasons. I think that's one of the reasons. I think that a lot of people make quilts for charity, and there are even some programs that say don't put a label on it, and I highly disagree with that. I think some people don't just because it's not about them. They feel that is something they're giving of themselves, but it's not about who they are. But the person that receives it doesn't know that. The person that receives it would love to know, I think, that you cared to make this quilt. And this is why you made them this quilt, and that you are from where they are from, or that you like purple and they like purple.
Right. So so I think you had a blog about the Women's March recently on your website and Pussy Hats.
Yes.
And so when every time I get upset, like the first thing is like, well, why are you upset? I'm like, well, first Hillary lost. that's where I like start my like, why am
go all the way back?
Right. It's like, well, let's start there. But after the election, I made like 25 hats. Like I just kept making hats because it seemed to make me feel better. And but the thing that was so interesting about it is that I did put the label on them, and I sent them off to DC with friends, and they just kind of they gave them to strangers on the mall.
I love that.
And they wrote back. So I learned about where all my hats went, and it was so meaningful. So this labeling thing, like I didn't really get the labeling thing until that happened. And then this year I heard from them again to say, hey, I'm wearing your hat again. And I just wanted to let you know that this is what I did for the anniversary. And I just thought, like,
I love that.
labeling matters. Like, it, as you said, like, having it, it isn't about like, oh, I made this hat. It